Since we're running a little bit behind time, we're going to keep introductions really short. So just as a reminder, Chen from the Washington University of St. Louis, who's going to be speaking today about memory, identity, politics, and the literary diversity of cultural revolution novels.
Thank you. Thank you. So my talk today is going to zero in on one particular text. But the broader aspect of my talk actually touches upon this kind of cross-cultural identity politics, identity politics that plays on cultural exoticism, experiential exoticism. So I'm going to take all of you back to the beginning of the Cold War. And I will just very quickly go through the historical trajectory and how this kind of identity politics that I will be talking about would then come into play. For about 3 decades, from 1949 to 1976, Mao's China remained a nation isolated from the international community. And in about 1977-78, when Deng Xiaoping came into power, China began, Deng Xiaoping opened up the nation, and China's political isolationism began to thaw, and contacts with nations started to pick up. And here are some of the numbers. One reflection of this kind of China PRC government's open door policy is its citizens going abroad. So according to the PRC Consulate General in Chicago website, the Chinese government started sending its students abroad in 1979. Among the nations, like Japan, Germany, Britain, France, and so on, United States was and still is the most popular destination for Chinese students seeking higher education. The years between 1989 and 94 saw the fastest increase of Chinese students in the United States, taking the lead of all other groups of foreign students. And by 2003, there were over 60,000 Chinese students studying in the United States alone. And today, Chinese students still, this group of foreign students still is the largest group. I think Indian students are the second. But in 2001, when 9/11 took place, the U.S. government started to tighten its visa control, as is understandable, and foreign students' growth in the U.S. Began to slow down. However, applications from China continued to rise to 19% from 2005 to 2006, and this is according to the Council of Graduate Schools. And a notable product of this large number of Chinese students in the United States is immigration. Based on a report on the American Physical Society website, the majority of Chinese students have historically tended to seek employment after earning their graduate degrees and stay permanently in the United States. And this is still true today. So with this growing number of Chinese citizens settling down in a new country and becoming immigrants themselves, it is not surprising that some of them would want to tell their unique personal experiences of growing up in Mao's China and those national isolation years. So today, my talk will discuss a popular literary phenomenon in the United States that emerged in the 1990s and early 2000, and this is what I call this literary phenomena is known as the Cultural Revolution memoirs and autobiographies. The characteristic of this body of works is the authors of this body of works are Chinese expatriates who have lived through the Mao era and experienced the socio-political upheaval, marked by the Cultural Revolution in particular. And here I have some examples. For example, Chen, her life and death in Shanghai. This is what I will focus on later on. Rongzhang, Wild Swans, An Qiming, Red Azalea, Dai Sijie, Balzac and the Little Chinese Seamstress was published in French at first. Ji Li Zhang, actually, her Red Scarf Girl, and Spider Eater Ray Young. Balzac and Little Chinese Seamstress, there's a film made out of the book. Little Chen, I'm sorry, this is not very clear. And Da Chen, Mountains, Colors of the Mountain. Mao's Last Dancer, there's also a film. Risk Golf Girl. Okay? All right, so those are just a tip of the iceberg. So what is really remarkable about this body of writings and their authors is not only the majority of such works is the very first attempt in writing in a foreign language, but these titles are also bestsellers and upon publication, and winners of literary awards, often with sales of millions of copies and translated into scores of languages worldwide. If only our academic books could be like this. The instant commercial success of these works spawned a new popular literary genre in a very loose sense of the term in the English publishing world, and cultivated a new breed of Chinese expatriate writers of memoirs, testimonies, and autobiographical fiction. So, authored by native Chinese, written in a Western language, primarily English, these Cultural Revolution memoirs guaranteed the Western readers a direct linguistic experience, meaning without the mediation of translation, as well as absolute cultural and experiential authenticity about Mao's China. In effect, these Chinese expatriate writers play the role of cultural informants who provide not only first-hand experience, first-hand knowledge of the communist China, but also personal testimonies to an incomprehensible human tragedy. So this is very important. These are all major selling points. In addition to feeding the West's historical fascination of the Orient, these memoirs of victimhood, which always end with finding salvation and happiness in the West, also help to strengthen the moral and emotional vulnerability felt in the post-Cold War and post-9/11 West. And so this is the first, I would like to focus on Western readers and the post-Cold War context. I want to build up the context first before I get into the textual analysis. When President Truman at the beginning of the Cold War drew the distinction between the free world and the oppressive communist world, he also imprinted in the collective psyche of the American people the conviction that the United States of America has a God-given duty to help people who long to be free. So the military and political race between the US-led capitalist West and the Soviet-led communist East thus was added with a moral characteristic. And this is much the same as the communist countries, the communist bloc. They were also convinced that they have this divine duty to liberate the world from the tyranny of imperialism and capitalism. So it's the same thing. So here we're talking about the moral dimension of the Cold War. So this competition grew out when the U.S.-backed Chinese Nationalist Party, led by Chiang Kai-shek, lost mainland China to the Chinese Communist Party in 1949. Psychologically, it created an imminent sense of threat to the West, as Martin Walker makes plain, and here I quote, "The crisis of morale over the loss of China was to be one of the worst of such times," end quote. So this sense of crisis deepened throughout the 1960s and the 70s with a series of setbacks. For example, riots that sprouted up in the US, in several Western European countries such as France, West Germany, Italy, Britain, and in Asia such as Japan. Popular support of the then little understood Mao and his Red Guards from students and intellectuals in the West. The American defeat in and loss of Vietnam to the communist side, the Soviets' successful invasion of Afghanistan, the US-Britain's failed coup d'etat in Iran and the subsequent demoralizing American hostage crisis, and of course, the increasingly unpredictable nuclear competition among several emerging powers. On the Chinese front, the international binary political atmosphere during the Cold War fueled Mao's ideological fervor to fight for the prosperity of communism. After Khrushchev's condemnation of Stalin in 1956, Mao, feeling outraged and betrayed, locked down the Chinese borders and determined to further enforce the ideological struggle in extinguishing imperialism and capitalism, which culminated in the launch of the Cultural Revolution. Of course, the launch of Cultural Revolution is much more complicated than what I just said, way more complicated, but that's not what I want to talk about today. As historian Rana Miller points out, and here I quote him, the Cultural Revolution happened as it did because China entered a somewhat artificial either-or binary discussion about the options open to it, partly because the nature of the binary Cold War logic forced Mao into this kind of binary thinking, and also partly because the nature of the political system, Maoism, by which it maintained itself, made the sort of inward-looking binarism the most natural path to follow at that time. And as you can find, this kind of binary thinking very prevalent in Wild Swans, in a lot of this kind of Cultural Revolution memoirs. Ironically, while Mao isolated China from the rest of the world, his reputation, along with his brand of socialism, communism, grew extremely popular in Latin America, Europe, the United States, as well as in many parts of Asia. Because of China's international isolation, fascination with this massive communist country grew with time. So during this time, only very few foreigners were allowed into China, and they were always closely monitored by the government. They weren't allowed to freely roam the country. With bits and pieces of information leaking out of China about the massive mobilization movement and destructions that went on in this mysterious Asian communist nation, the outside world's curiosity could only continue to grow. And this suspended thirst for anything coming from within the Chinese borders finally was quenched by the publications of Cultural Revolution memoirs by mainstream commercial publishing houses, beginning in late 1980s, marked by Chen's Life and Death in Shanghai, which was published in 1986, and epitomized by Zhang's Wild Swans, published in 1991. It is therefore not difficult to imagine how the Cultural Revolution memoirs, which began to come out in the late 80s, would draw such attention and attracted an immense readership in the West. These memoirs serve to remind the West of its ideological triumph and the value system for which it has advocated and fought. Particularly, the extensive popularity of these Cultural Revolution memoirs in the US attests to the highly treasured value of freedom and democracy held by the American people, a value instigated by Truman at the onset of the Cold War. The predictable happy ending of these memoirs, in which the author protagonist finds a new chance in life in the West, also testifies to the legitimacy of Western values and its moral leadership. Furthermore, these memoirs' exposure of the atrocity in Mao's China helps to make the world easy to live in, because in these memoirs, the division between good and evil remains distinct. Victims and perpetrators are easily distinguishable, and evil is always defeated in the end. In reality, though, and we all know, the world has become much more complicated since the end of the Cold War, and even more so after the 9/11 attack, as the free world now finds itself fighting an invisible enemy, terrorists, in an unconventional war in which there are no battlefronts, no clear targets to shoot at, and more importantly, good and evil are not as apparent as they used to be. Reversely, seeing from the vantage point of the Cultural Revolution memoir writer, the play on the unquestionable authenticity of suffering facilitates the writer individual in his or her formation of a new social, cultural identity endowed with moral and cultural authority. So Zhang Rongzhang's immensely successful memoir, Wild Swans, Three Daughters of China. So before I get into that, these are some of the major, primary major political events, campaigns of the Mao era. So you have the land reform and the three anti-rights of, 三反五反, three antis and five antis campaign, targeted primarily the intellectuals. Then you have the Korean War, and then you have Let 100 Flowers Bloom in '57, anti-rightist movement. They born out of this, Mao, after the 100 Flowers Bloom, identified his true enemies, and then he started the anti-rightist movement and locked them all up. And then the Great Leap Forward, which created the largest man-made famine in human history, the Great Famine. Over 30 million people died during this famine. And then the Cultural Revolution. And then Mao passed away in '76, and that's how the Cultural Revolution ended. Otherwise, it would have gone on. Okay, so Wild Swans. Rongzhang's immensely successful memoir, Wild Swans, Three Daughters of China, has established for her among popular reading public worldwide an indisputable authority of Mao's China and its history. The wide popularity of Wild Swans has also paved the way for Chang's subsequent publication, Mao, the Unknown Story, which is probably the most ambitious and also the most controversial biography of this Chinese leader to date. Another successful example is An Qiming's Red Azalea. Writing the tidal wave created by Wild Swans, An Qiming employs a completely different but equally effective narrative strategy in her instant bestseller, Red Azalea. And Red Azalea was published in 1994, and of course it's An Qiming's first book, right? An Qiming left China to the United States in 1984 with very little English. I mean, she was already, an adult. After she survived the Cultural Revolution, and then with help, she came to the United States in '84 with almost no English. She began writing about her experiences growing up in China in her English as second language classes. 10 years after having learned English, An Qiming published her memoir, Red Azalea, which has been named a New York Times Notable Book of the Year. It was a New York Times bestseller in '95 and has sold its rights to in more than 20 countries. This is quite an impressive accomplishment for a first-time non-native speaking author. By confessing to Western readers, An Qiming, her public denunciation of her of her high school English teacher, and then her homosexual relationship with her commander in the farm where she labored, An Qiming sets herself up as the real survivor who has done it all during a tumultuous period in modern Chinese history. Her feminine approach in intimating her personal experiences during a fascinating historical moment, also including a close encounter with Madame Mao, Jiang Qing, opens up the fictional space for An Qiming to write her subsequent quasi-historical novels centering on several female leaders in China's history, beginning with Jiang Qing and her role in the Cultural Revolution. So, if we combine Rongzhang's obsession with Mao with An Qiming's enthrallment with Madame Mao, these two Chinese expatriate writers surely have provided Western readers a sensational portrayal of modern China's most powerful political couple. A counterexample of these two memoirs and the like is a collection by a group of female academics, most of whom are former educated youths zhiqing in Mao's China. The editors of this collection declare in the very beginning of the book that the book is motivated by the desire to debunk the pain and recovery autobiographical accounts popular in the West. Some of us, Chinese women growing up in the Mao era, brings together 9 women who are already more established than I am, established scholars in Chinese studies, primarily in modern Chinese literature field, occupying tenure positions in American universities. These authors offer an alternative to the monolithic representation of the Cultural Revolution as a quote-unquote dark age of persecution and violence, which is of course a stereotypical depiction that has dominated the popular perception and imagination of Western readers. These 9 essays tend to correct, their intention is to correct the imbalance of portrayal of Mao's China by adding to the stereotypical narrative of the collective experience of the Cultural Revolution as more than just suffering and injustice. The memoirs are collective, these are basically very short memoirs, collectively present a positive and reflective experience of growing up during the Cultural Revolution. Thank you. Focusing primarily on the aspects of self and gender identity building process. So most of these nine memoirs of Vigne's are all very positive, happy accounts. This collection presents an interesting anomaly to an otherwise very tidy anti-communist Anglophone mnemonic narrative of the Cultural Revolution that helps to maintain the West's conviction of its global leading moral position established during the Cold War. The identity politics in these 3 popular Cultural Revolution memoirs is intriguing, to say the least. Rong Zhang and An Qiming established their professional as well as a new cultural identity by way of adhering to, if not also reinforcing, the Orientalist discourse. The 9 authors of Some of Us came into the scene with an already established professional and a new cultural identity, so they don't have to worry about it. And thus are positioned to challenge the Orientalist discourse by going against the grain. While there are apparently 2 competing discourses in remembering the Cultural Revolution among the Chinese expatriates, does the contradiction emerging from these personal memoirs necessarily destabilize the superior moral perception of the Western readers vis-a-vis their, the Western nations vis-a-vis their readers, such as the United States? Do Western readers care to learn about the complexity of China's red legacy, as the 9 authors of Some of Us try to illustrate in their memoirs? History is built upon individual memories. How memories are presented and represented, and how the ethics of remembering is upheld, do bear consequences of how we create our knowledge of history. Herein lies the moral question of identity construction in memory writings such as these memoirs, which I will discuss in the next section. Helen Bush asserts that the memoir, more so than the autobiography, has an intrinsic affinity to history in that it contains the memoir writer's personal knowledge of a certain historical moment in its cultural, political, or social events, and that it serves as a vehicle through which the interrogation of the private individual's relationship to a history or a culture is conducted. The search for meaning in any form of life writing is inherent in the author's desire for identity reconstruction. The narrating I, the narrating I, therefore plays a very complicated but nonetheless important role in this endeavor. To understand the value of one's life, to make sense of it, implies applying certain moral concepts to the ongoing self-evaluation. Because the genre of life writing has the unique aura of authenticity and authority, in the sense that it concerns truthful telling of and reflecting on a real life or life experience by the very individual who possesses such knowledge. A widely received memoir or autobiography may reveal or reflect a psychological, emotional, or moral trend of a collective mentality or subjectivity at a given historical moment. The memoirist's establishing of a moral self is transmitted to the readers who get the satisfaction of learning how to live their own lives. The lesson learned then means the moral good has been transmitted from the writer to the reader. As argued by David Parker, and here I quote, "The good is an inescapable framework for understanding any human agent and therefore for any writer of life narrative. That making the best sense of lives requires the use of thick evaluative languages of the good," end quote. So value-loaded notions or words such as honesty, courage, love, and truthfulness are the moral core of identity. In other words, relation to oneself is anchored by such moral values by which one finds self-worth. But it is important to remember that moral good is also shaped by culture and conditioned by historical time. And what one individual upholds to be the core of his or her moral good often also reflects what are deemed the most important values in his or her culture and time. So in the next section, I will analyze Wild Swans and its author Rong Zhang to see what moral good is driving the narrative, and if the narrating language reflects any moral values that are particular to the author's cultural background and historical positioning, and with its wide popularity in the West, how the reader's reception in turn reflects the core values of the West in this particular historical juncture of the late 20th century and the early 21st century. So among the many Cultural Revolution memoirs published in the West, this one by Rong Zhang definitely stands out. Today, it probably still holds the biggest grossing non-fiction paperback in publishing history worldwide, with more than 10 million copies sold and translation in more than 30 languages. And I've heard that in some high schools in this country, the book is used as a textbook to teach modern Chinese history. This is Zhang's second book. The first one, which she co-authored with her then 9-year husband, John Holliday, Madame Sun Yat-sen, was in '86, did not seem to matter to the reading public at all. And her third book, and also the latest book, also, co-authored with her now husband about the unknown story, published in 2005, is a highly controversial biography that I already mentioned. Popular and commercial reviews of Wild Swans are full of admiration and adulation. Commonly found praise words include evocative, riveting, inspiring, powerful, moving, courageous, truthful, and so on. I have surveyed numerous reviews on the internet and found that the general readers seem to have taken this book as a historical introduction to modern China, and hence, later on it evolved into some kind of quasi-history book, a textbook for some high schools. Many expressed surprise to learn about the true condition of Mao's China and the Cultural Revolution. But primarily, the readers admired the author's ability to transcend personal bitterness, as well as her family members' love and devotion for each other. Ultimately, to the Western readers, Wild Swans is held as an intimate testimony to the triumph of the human spirit, despite unprecedented hardship and suffering. Reviews by literary critics and scholars, however, are very much different. They are much more critical of the book and in this genre in general. For example, literary scholar Chen argues that these writers, who are mostly women, intentionally represent the narrator, quote, as the only heroine while rejecting others as persecutors of the innocent, end quote. Shu Meishi, she's a professor at UCLA. She critiques such memoirs of sensationalizing traumatic experiences about China's Cultural Revolution in order to gain a market niche in the West. And their colleague Yue Minbao adds that these memoirs are, quote, geared towards an audience in the West and expound the ideology of victimization or personal suffering, end quote. One academic book review challenges the historical and experiential comprehensiveness posited by the author, that the memoir recounts lives of 3 generations of Chinese women from the pre-revolutionary time to the end of the Cultural Revolution. The reviewer questions such authority since Rong Zhang's judgment on and criticism of a period of tremendous social turmoil is essentially informed by her privileged position of being a member of the high official family. Both Rong Zhang's parents, father and mother, occupy very high position in the government and in the party. While agreeing with the above assessments, I believe the essential issue here is how Rong Zhang and the writers of this genre are able to, on the one hand, establish themselves as spokesperson of China to present China in a stereotypical, monolithic fashion, that of hardship and victimization, while on the other hand, present their personal lives as testimonies to moral good such as courage, honesty, and love for family and freedom. So answers to this question are inevitably complex, since I believe we must consider both sides, the producer-writer and the receiver-reader. But I do believe the narrative strategy devised by Rong Zhang among those employed by writers of this genre is one of the most effective, and that has a lot to do with its immense popularity. Because in this book, in this so-called memoir, she is able to establish her moral authority and authenticity, which in turn guarantee her the place of the spokesperson and a new identity in the West. Consistent throughout Wild Swans are 2 Rong Zhangs. This is my analysis. There are 2 Rong Zhangs. The narrator, who stands on moral high ground, detached and objective, and the heroine, one of the 3 Chinese daughters, who lived through the Mao era, experienced the brainwash and hardship, and witnessed the unjust treatment suffered by her parents. So you have two Rong Zhangs. The memoir is narrated in a third-person omniscient narrator, similar to that in a realist novel. From the onset, the narrative of Wild Swans is conditioned by the narrator's large dosage of historical anecdotes that reads more like a historical novel than a personal memoir. So Wild Swans basically tells the stories of 3 Chinese women: Rong Zhang's maternal grandmother, who was married at the age of 15 to a Manchurian warlord general as a concubine, and later she escaped and then married a doctor. Zhang's mother as a devoted communist, a popular local political leader, a wife and a mother, and Zhang herself and herself growing up, during that period. This book ends with Zhang arriving Great Britain as one of the first Chinese graduate students studying in the West. The year was 1978. So the book opens like a typical memoir or autobiography with a family tree and a chronology from the year 1870 when her maternal grandmother's second husband, which is kind of odd, second husband, Dr. Xia, was born. And to the 1978 when Zhang left China. But what's interesting is, next to this so-called family chronology or family tree, is the national chronology of major political events that shaped and comprised the history of modern China. So you have the family chronology and the national chronology. Important events like the 1911 revolution, the establishment of Republic of China, the civil war between Mao and Jiang, the birth of 1949, and so on and so forth. And then immediately after this family versus nation chronology, then is a map of China. Unlike a conventional memoir in which the larger context normatively falls within the parameters of the author's family, and more specifically to the author's personal life or life experiences, Rongzhang's memoir of 3 generations is closely pit against the political trajectory of modern China, particularly Mao's China. The family's ups and downs correspond closely to the twists and turns of the nation's political developments. So to achieve this kind of mirroring of the personal and the national, Rongzhang's narrative strategy is to create a double role for herself, like I just said. One is this omniscient narrator, commentator of history, and the other is a character, one of the 3 heroines in the narrative itself. And this is what I call a schizophrenic approach of splitting herself in 2 identities with different narratological functions, allow Rongzhang, the narrator, to be a spectator of the horrendous historical events while still maintaining her role, the heroine, as a victim of those events. The double standing gives Rongzhang moral authority as someone who is in line with history and justice, and authenticity as someone who actually experienced the trauma. Because of her detached self-positioning in the narrative, her characters often appear flat, with the only exception of her mother. The story of her grandmother is very sketchy. Her mother, Rongzhang's mother, is really the one who occupies the majority of the narrative, and Zhang herself is sort of kind of a sidekick of her mother. Instead of employing her first-person autobiographical narrator to navigate her private psychological space, Rongzhang reflects very little on growing up, personal memory of the past. So we really don't know how she went through this kind of growing up a journey and how she became the person that she is today. We know very little of that, actually. There's a very good example from the book, and that is the moment when Rongzhang was in high school. She was recruited to join the Red Guards. She described her being, very reluctant, very shy, very unwilling. So she feigned illness to escape the political meetings and the frightening slogans. And then when she was informed that because you are the child of the Gaogan, the high officials, you are the natural candidate to become one of Mao's babies, the little Red Guards. So she immediately, submitted her application, but still maintained throughout that, she was just a very passive participant. When the Red Guards ran into people's homes to ransack their homes, she would just stand in the back and so on. As a matter of fact, in 2006 in summer, I ran into a person in Hong Kong who happened to Rongzhang's first mentor in the Great Britain, and he knows what really happened during Rongzhang's so-called Red Guard years. In fact, Rongzhang was one of the leaders of the Red Guard factions. She was very active, very much in the forefront. Okay, so it's completely different, completely opposite from what she tells in this book. So it is kind of but readers don't know this, right? So anyhow. So by portraying herself as a person unable to think on her own and blaming her lack of reflection to fear and blind worship of Mao, Rongzhang basically rids herself of any moral responsibility. Okay? And so the heroine, by contrast, by constantly characterizing herself as a frightened, passive, and insulated child and young adult, Rongzhang thus is able to steer away from reflecting or engaging with her own past. The heroine Zhang is basically muted in the narrative, treated as an innocent and frightened object, while the author-narrator Zhang functions as a speaking subject who freely expresses her criticism and judgment on external elements that cause hardship to her and her family. So instead of creating a psychological temporal order to delve into the emotional and the mental state of the suffering victims, the memoir's plotting of events adheres strictly to the right and wrong dichotomy. Rong Zhang also in this book creates two Chinas, two different images of Chinas. One is the collective suffering Chinese victimized by the treacherous regime, and the other, the vicious regime perpetrator who inflicts injustice and cruelty to the masses. So in Zhang's own words, quote, "The whole China was like a prison. Every house, every street was watched by the people themselves. In this vast land, there was nowhere anyone could hide," end quote. If a prison is guarded by the prisoners, and if the prisoners are tortured by prisoners themselves, then then the line between the victim and the perpetrator needs to be blurred, because they are both victims and perpetrators, and that is the truth of the Cultural Revolution. But in Zhang's following description of her parents' predicaments at that time, there is obviously a line that clearly divides up the bad guys and the good guys. Quote, the atmosphere outside was terrifying, with the violent street-corner denunciation meetings and all the sinister wall posters and slogans. People were walking like zombies, with harsh or cowed expressions on their faces. What was more, my parents' bruised faces marked them as condemned, and if they went out, they ran a risk of being abused, end quote. So here, the house that shelters her parents segregates the innocent victims, her parents, from the vicious perpetrators who are essentially the rest of the people and the world outside. So if Rong Zhang is claiming that the entire Chinese populace is guilty, while only a small handful of people like her family, then we really have to question this kind of logic and this kind of statement, because historically it just cannot sustain itself, this kind of statement. So in this book, the clear distinction between the absolute good and the absolute bad, be it to portray herself or to characterize her parents, is highly problematic and suspicious. And there's a very interesting review by Timothy Cheek, and here he says, despite its impressive reference apparatus, Zhang and Holliday's book, this one, is not a history in the accepted sense of a recent historical analysis. Oh, I'm sorry. He is commenting on Mao's biography, but it applies to this book as well. It is ironically a Maoist denunciation of Mao himself, done in the florid style of the Cultural Revolution denunciations, an unrelenting People magazine storyline in which all action derives from Mao or Stalin or moles or traitors, all of whom are completely and consistently bad, bad, and bad. So the first and foremost rhetorical device of the Maoist style denunciations is a black and white dichotomy, and that's exactly what she's done here. Without going any further on this kind of rhetorical application, this one clearly explains what lies behind the schizophrenic approach that I have talked about. What Zhang has done in this book is precisely the same exercise she has witnessed and perhaps participated over and over again during the Cultural Revolution. She has employed in her own memoir the same condemnation strategy formulated by Mao to write back to the man, Mao, who has victimized her and her family. So in effect, Wild Swans is a lesser version of what she and Holliday has accomplished in their Mao biography. But basically, both books are what Cheek argues, an ironic Maoist attack on Mao himself. So Zhang's Cultural Revolution style of denunciation, or what I argue schizophrenic approach, is seen again here in her dubious treatment of China, and that I just explained. So essentially, this split China establishes for Rong Zhang a new identity in the Western world. On the one hand, it legitimizes and exoticizes her as a new Orient who reaffirms the West's rescuing power for its suffering Asian other. Rongzhang has thus achieved the kind of recognition that would mark her new cultural identity in the West by inscribing her particular eye into the social, political, cultural, and historical landscape of the post-Cold War, post-9/11 world. She achieves the moral authority and authenticity of a Chinese expatriate who has had her share of injustice and hardship under a communist dictator, and who now fights for all those who also have endured the same fate. And that is her narrative. The moral spotlight of this memoir is constantly cast on the self of the author narrator, Zhang. She speaks for individual courage, prevails against authoritarian suppression, and tells the truth of history. It is this I who has successfully bonded with Western readers, the moral self with whom Western readers identify. While autobiography or memoir should go beyond political debate to more profound examination of the self and the moral fabric of a culture, Wild Swans seems to have gone on the opposite direction. But we should also bear in mind that the culture and the media industry in the West, actually in the world, has been driven by consumer capitalism and can barely sustain its social responsibility. Ranging from reality TV to the memoir industry, confession no longer expresses self-reflection and moral examination, but instead it produces identities of victimhood. Wild Swans and other expatriate cultural revolution memoirs that I mentioned earlier are precisely such products. Thank you. I guess we still have time. So any comments? Yes.
Just an observation coming from the viewpoint of Southeast Asia, I'm struck by potential parallels with similar literature coming out of Vietnam and the Vietnam War. And I don't know if you've looked at that as well, or if you venture any comparisons.
I hope to go to Southeast Asia soon. Yeah. This is just currently my current book project. This is part of one of the chapters of my current book project. And the larger project is really to look at memory writings of the Mao era. It's not just by the Chinese overseas, what we call the diasporic Chinese, but also by different generations of Chinese themselves. In fact, the second half of this chapter, I look at similar memoirs, Cultural Revolution memoirs, but produced by Chinese in China. And very different, but the identity politics is exactly the same. It's exactly the same. Those Chinese memoir authors, they also use their experiences either of suffering, victimhood, to reassert their place in the 21st century, because that generation of Chinese basically is a forgotten generation, a lost generation. They missed their opportunity to go to school, to go to college, and now China is completely opened up. It's basically a consumer-driven market economy, and a lot of these what we call the Red Guard generations, the Zhiqing generation, the educated youth generations, the majority of them cannot compete in today's workplace. And so their sacrifice, their fought for Mao's revolutionary idealism is completely forgotten. So what do? They write memoirs, they write biographies, either they want to highlight, it actually depends on the generation. For the older generation, people who grew up during the Mao era, who were already older, like in college age, their memoirs tend to gear towards suffering and victimhood. For those who were younger, who participated in the Cultural Revolution after the 70s, they were just junior high school kids, their memoirs and memoirs, they tend to be memoirs, are happy accounts. And I would characterize them as kind of a Boy Scout, Girl Scout, camping expedition, that kind of memories. But both kinds sell very well in the marketplace in China. And there is a huge red legacy industry. Those called the nostalgia industry. They have the Cultural Revolution style restaurants with the kind of menus. They have red tours that will take you through the Long March. They take you to visit Mao's home village, to take you to visit some important sites, historical sites, fashion. The red guard cap, the book bag. Serve the nation, 为人民服务, serve the people. So this is this to me it is actually dangerous because true history is now being glossed over with this kind of very inconsistent and oftentimes not exactly faithful accounts of the past. And in the history book, in their history textbooks, this kind of things, the Mao era is not mentioned very much. Cultural Revolution probably occupies a couple paragraphs, if that. The Great Forward used to occupy at least 2-3 sentences. Now it's reduced to 1 sentence. Very soon, all these will be forgotten because the survivors are getting old, they are dying out. So this is a very important, I was just telling Kathleen that Susan Solomon, she's an American scholar in history and literature. She called this, our memories of World War II has come to a point of a crisis of memory. This particular juncture where competing memory discourses are simultaneously present. So you have competing narratives, different stories, accounts of a historical moment that creates a crisis of memory. And this is the particular juncture or moment that can be the most productive for us to really get into more research, deeper, better understanding of the past. And so I see in China today, it has arrived at this moment, this crisis of memory, of Mao's memory, or memory towards Mao, about Mao's era. It has come to this point, and that's why I believe we need to, at least in the China field, we need to do much more studies of that particular of that era. So.